Watch and Google are telling me both it's 1 o'clock, time to get started. So let's go ahead and get going. Here we go. My name is Jim Nitterauer. I'm the Director of Information Security at Graylog. Thanks for coming out. I hope you're enjoying your RSA 2023 conference. Today's talk is corporate reputation attacks, dissecting the latest job scam offers. And we're going to get into a little bit of detail here. First, the disclaimer that RSA makes me put out there. And from our part, some of this information was gathered from various sources. It's used by permission, except for one slide, which I'm not going to get permission from that person to use it. And the rest is identifying information is removed where it's appropriate. So let's get started. First, imagine yourself, if you will, close your eyes and think with me for a minute. A world with significant layoffs. We've got rising salaries, remote work becoming the norm. Potential workers are eager for career growth, and everyone is seeking new and better opportunities. Now imagine yourself in a role that you don't really enjoy, with a salary that's substandard, with very few, if any, benefits, and little opportunity for advancement. All right, you get an email. That email offers you a position working for a very well-known tech company with a salary that's life-changing, providing excellent benefits, all while working remotely. All you need to do is get through the interview screening. Now hold that picture in your mind, and we'll come back to that in a few minutes. First, a brief history, a short history lesson. Scamming is a profession as old as time. The Brooklyn Bridge, you've heard the saying, if you believe that, I've got a bridge to sell you. Well, that came about from a saying that happened when, right after the Brooklyn Bridge was built in 1883. In 1899, a con artist and future mayor of New York City, Peaches O'Day, sold the bridge for $200 to some unsuspecting person. Another person served 2.5 years in Sing Sing for selling the same bridge in 1901. So scamming is as old as time. You've probably heard of some of these modern day scammers. You know what a Ponzi scheme is. You know who Frank Abagnale is, right? Catch Me If You Can, that movie. There's some information about Jordan Belfort, the Wolf of Wall Street. These are all scammers that scam people in various ways. You have Mr. Robot is based on the scamming that happened with the Enron Corporation, E-Corp or Evil Corp. If you look at their logo, it's the inverse of the Enron logo. Some modern day cyber scams, right? The Morris worm in 1988. We had Kevin Poulsen faked out a radio station and took over the right caller to win a Porsche in the 1990s. In 1994, a couple of hackers hacked and installed a sniffer on the U.S. Air Force network. We had in the 1980s and 90s, we had the Nigerian email scams, Stuxnet worm, and some LulzSec hacking. And then some more recent scams are fake Pokemon Go updates, some dating scam sites, a few other odds and ends, romance scams, and then, of course, fake job scams. A few statistics here. According to a 2021 report by the Better Business Bureau, job scams were the riskiest type scam based on median loss and total dollars lost in 2020. The median loss for a victim was $1,500, and a total of $4.1 billion was lost to employment scams in the U.S. in 2021. A 2020 survey by the site JobFlex FlexJobs found that 76% of job seekers had come across a job scam at some point during their job search, and 20% had been victims of a job scam in one way, shape, or form. The Federal Trade Commission also reported that it received over 160,000 reports of employment and income scams in 2020 for a total loss of $1.97 million. Now, if you go back and look at 2022, the next year, the losses were reported at about $250 million that were tied with this, and the average loss per scam went up to around $2,000 a scam. Well, you may say, well, are we making any progress in stopping these scammers? Yes, we are. The government's made a number of arrests, and they put people in jail for this. I don't know if you heard about this Hush Puppy. He's a famous rapper from Nigeria. He was arrested in Dubai in 2020 and sentenced to 11 years in prison for his scamming operation. So what does it take to pull off a fake job scam? Well, first you have to create a plausible fake job posting. You have to have a salary and benefits that sound too good to be true. That's the bait, right? You have to post it on multiple less than reputable job boards, and we'll talk about that a little bit moving forward. You have to gain access to the applicant database, and then you have to go fishing for the victims, and then you have to dupe them into believing what your scam is. Well, how does a scam work? What's the payoff? And we're going to get to looking at how that happens. So back to our story. Remember the image in your mind. I think P.T. Barnum was right when he said it. He said, the common man, no matter how sharp or how tough, actually enjoys having the wool pulled over their eyes, and it makes it easier for the puller. He also said, many people are gullible and we can expect this to continue. That's why we all have jobs, right? And you can fool most of the people most of the time. So he was pretty right on, and he was about 1900 when he made these statements. So first thing, we started getting notification at the end of August. One victim contacted us, and we found that the scammers were using two different domains that were similar to Graylog.org. Graylog.org is our legitimate domain. And we had the scammers using Graylog with two L's and then Graylog.co. The first actual report that we had was that somebody found this Graylog.co website, which was simply including our legitimate website in an iframe in that site. So that was the first indication I had that something was going wrong on the internet with our corporate reputation. I didn't know what it was at that time. Within a day, I received notice from our HR manager, Kate, and I'll go into more details about her in a second, that she was getting reports of people that were being scammed and being offered job positions by Kate, but it really wasn't Kate, and I'll go into the details about that here in just a second. So the first thing I did when I found out about these domain names is I looked up who the registrar was. Fortunately, I have a relationship with some of the folks at Namecheap. I was able to contact them, and they were able to take down that one domain within about 4 or 5 days. And the other domain, it took quite a while for GoDaddy to take that one down. So what happened was the scammers were using one domain initially, and they pivoted and started using the other domain pretty much right away. All right, so first victim provided us with this email that she received. This email here talks about how they're going to do, how they're going to do an interview with them. They're going to do the interview over Teams chat, and they're talking about the scheduling of that interview. And if you see here, you can see that the hourly rate's in there. The interview is to get to know them better, and you'll do it over Teams. There was no video usage at all during these interviews. So this victim then went through the interview process, and here's a snippet from the interview that this person did. And you can see up here that they used Kate Meikle. She is actually our HR manager in our Houston office, so it's a real person, but this is not Kate. They used our Graylog logo, and a lot of this text that they sent back to the victim was cut and pasted from our legitimate website and just simply thrown into the chat at the appropriate time. And if you read through the whole chat, the context of the dialogue just doesn't make sense. It's not, it doesn't flow the way it should for a normal job interview. So what happened here is they're talking about what's going on with the position, how much it pays, and if you'll notice, I think they even changed the rate, right? The first Teams chat said it was $40 an hour. Here they say $35, so the scammers can't even get their story straight, and I'll show you more about that in just a second. But then they also talk about coming to the headquarters. You're not necessarily needing to do that. And they mention in here that you're going to get some money for a bonus, that you're going to get paid time and a half, and that we'll work out how we get your office equipment. But they don't go into much detail. They're just building trust at this point. Then later on, after the person goes through the interview, what they do is they send the person one of these emails. This is actually the email that this person received. And if you'll notice, the email address that it's from up here is different than the original one. It's the Graylog. That one might be the Graylog.org. I can't see it from here. But they tell them what's going to happen. And you'll see here they're imitating another person at our company, Sam Parikh. He is our Chief Operating Officer. He has absolutely nothing to do with hiring experience or training anybody at the company. They just happened to find his name on the internet and decided to make it seem legitimate by putting him as the next contact that this person would be in contact with. The other thing they did in this message here is they talk about getting documents signed and running a background check, and they talk about getting it by 8 o'clock the next morning. So they put some urgency into the message to make sure that the person doesn't have time to think about it, doesn't have time to see through the scam. They're making it like they need to do this right away. And there's two documents attached here. One of them is an offer letter, and I'll show you the details of that in a second. The other one is a benefits package that was a complete mess, but it looked like the best benefits in the world. Pretty much 100% healthcare coverage, 6 weeks vacation, best benefits you could imagine, all thrown together in one package. But we're going to look at this one document here with the offer letter in just a second here. All right, so here's the offer letter. This is the top half of it. Scammers aren't very good at covering their tracks, right? So they take an old logo, old Graylog logo. They use a date in the wrong format at the top. And look who they're saying this person's going to be working for. Asana. Asana is not Graylog, right? So right away, if anybody's paying attention to what they're reading, they shouldn't have signed this letter. They talk down here more about Asana, and at the bottom they also talk about Asana, and then it says, welcome to Graylog, and we look forward to working with you. So this letter is what they got people to sign. Once people signed this letter and returned it to them, they would go and go to the next step of the scam, which we weren't aware of at this point because this was our first victim. And this victim started chatting with the scammers here, and this is actually one of their real phone numbers. That's the actual scammer's number. You can call it if you want. There's not there anymore. They realized that this person had reported it to us, that this person was not, was probably aware that they were being scammed. So what I did at this point, I have some Google numbers that I use for, shall we say, a little social engineering. I went back to the scammer's number because I knew what the number was. I messaged them and said I was this victim and asked them what I needed to do next and got to have a dialogue with them that way for a little while. That worked until they realized that it wasn't the victim. Okay, so remember those two documents that were attached there, PDF files, right? So this is the employment letter. A lot of information can be gathered from these kinds of documents. I don't know if you're familiar with Kali Linux or the EXIF tool, but basically this just pulls all the metadata that's in a file, takes it out and gives it to you in an order that you can look at it. The important thing here that you would look at would be where it was made, right? So this document was created in Word for Office 365, the web version, not the desktop version. The other interesting thing is, if you know this or not, but every document that's created in Office 365 and in Word has what's called a GUID ID, a unique identifier. That unique identifier can be tied back to the tenant that's in Microsoft. So in this case, we were able to supply these documents to Microsoft and they were able to shut down their tenant because they could see that these documents were being created through that tenant. But the other interesting thing is, scammers aren't the brightest bulbs in the box, right? There's a name there, King Akpasiri, and we'll come back to what that means in just a little bit. But that's an important piece of information. The other thing you can see in here is the date that the document was created. In this case, it was created the day before we got the report. So if you look back at the date that was on the email, the first contact to the victim was contacted on the 25th or 24th of August. The 29th, this was sent, the victim contacted us on the 30th. So that's kind of the timeline of how that worked. And we're pretty sure that this was the first victim. I'll show you why, because the employment letter would always be different for every other victim, but this next document here is actually the benefits booklet, and this document was the same for every victim. As you can see, this was created on the 28th, and that was always the same date and time stamp on every copy that we received of this from every victim. In this case, this person put in a different name, Jaron. That was a little bit interesting because I was able to actually speak with that person via chat and got some information that I'm not going to disclose at this point, but was able to talk with that person and figure out where they were, who they were, and why they were doing what they were doing. The second victim report came in on 9/3, so a few days later, 5 more on the 6th, 2 more on the 7th, and the reports kept coming in until we had 33 people reporting to us, and all of them shared as much data as they could with us because we had prepared for them to send that information in. All right, so first steps that we had taken right after the first victim was we contacted the domain registrar. Now I'm just summarizing what we did so you can kind of think about a playbook here, and I'll talk about steps you can take at the end, but I'm just going over what we did. We contacted the domain registrars requesting that domains be shut down. That did work. Ultimately, the scammers reverted to using Gmail and Outlook.com emails, which we then kept referring back to Microsoft and Google, and they kept shutting them down. So we were playing this whack-a-mole game to keep the emails at bay. We sent the files to Microsoft for analysis. They were able to shut down their tenant, take away their rights. We implemented the rules in Cloudflare to prevent the inclusion in other sites, and I would suggest that you do this with your websites. You can put some header tags in your websites and make sure that they're not included in frames or in other non-top level containers within a web browser. We analyzed the metadata and began uncovering the origin of the scam. We contacted some of the scammers and started asking them questions, basically doing this clandestinely. I wouldn't recommend doing this unless you're good at it. And we created an internal reporting form. We distributed that company-wide so that when a report came in, we could collect a standard set of data from each of the victims. We drafted a response message to send to the victims, and we contacted the Secret Service and the FBI. This is a copy of the email that went out to each of the victims as they were reported, and basically it tells them, this was later down the road after I realized what the full scam was, what was happening to them, why it was happening, and how to report it to the FBI. And then we would gather information. Each of the victims was very much willing to share everything that they were getting from the scammer with us. All right, so our ongoing actions, once we had been through all of these 33, we aggregated more than 10 phone numbers that were being used to perpetrate these scams. We contacted the carriers that owned these phone numbers, or sites where you can go on the internet and look up who owns a particular number. We were able to contact the carriers and let them know what was going on. And do you think the carriers turned off those numbers? They didn't care, did not care. They just said, they're resold through some reseller, we don't believe you, you have to fill out this form. We'd fill out the form, send it, and nothing would happen. We aggregated the email addresses that were used to email the victims, and we reported those either Google or Microsoft once they were using non-domain-based things. They were using either Gmail or Outlook.com. And then we aggregated the links from Teams and Skype and reported that to Microsoft, because those were the tools they were using. So at the end, they reverted to only interviewing people through chat via the Google numbers or whatever numbers they were using. We reported the fake job postings to the providers as we found them, and we also had them remove the scammers' access from their site, because we had to prove that we were Graylog and that the scammers then had their access taken away. We posted information in our corporate blog on LinkedIn and Twitter about our processes for hiring and how we went through that process so that people could actually see what the process was and know who would be contacting them. And then we continued doing some research to find the identity of the scammer. Grab a drink here real quick. So how did we uncover what was going on with the rest of the scam? What's the payoff? Why are the scammers doing this? Why would they offer somebody a fake job? Well, this little snippet of the chat here kind of gives it away. Here, this person, the scammer, pretending to be Kate, is talking to the victim over here and telling the victim they're going to send them all of this office equipment, software, all of these things. They're going to get a check here. Here's an example of that. This is actually a photo of one of the checks that one of the victims got. Up here is the FedEx address that it was sent from. I'll go into that in just a second. So they would send them these checks, and that, you can't see the amount there, but that's like $3,800 on that check. The checks range from $3,500 to $7,000 in value. The victim would get the check via FedEx, and they were instructed to put that check in the bank. And immediately after that, the scammer told them that they were to Zelle or Venmo them the money for all of that equipment. You see how this works. Person puts a check in their bank, $7,000, keep $2,000 for a bonus, send us the rest. They're out $6,800. Went even further than that. The scammers knew when they got the Zelle payments that that person was going to send the money. They immediately, as soon as they got the payments, contacted that person and said, we didn't send you enough money for the equipment that you need. We're going to send you more equipment. They could send them a check the next day. So Wednesday they would interview them. Thursday they'd get a check, deposit that check. Friday they'd get another check, deposit that check. By Monday the first check bounces, and then the victim's out the money. They also would send them this follow-up notice here, basically forcing them to say, hey, we want to know who you are and where you put this money. But this is very scammy, but they were asking for this AOL account to get their bank information. They wanted to force the victim to think that they were serious and that they were going to track the check, but in doing so, they were actually getting the person's banking information, which wasn't good. And here's an example of one of the screenshots from one of the Zelle accounts, and that's actually one of the real scammers' accounts. So if you see that name anywhere, beware. I think that's actually some famous singer's name, but they just picked that name for their account. So this is how the scam worked, and the check eventually bounces, people are out the money, and the scammers win. Now, fortunately, most of the people that we talked to, very few of them gave them money. Some of them didn't have any money to give them and even wouldn't take the check because they didn't have a bank account, right? So they get the check, they couldn't do anything with the check. There was nowhere to deposit the money. So then the scammers would revert to getting them to go buy cash. They would go to the bank and buy, or the store and buy gift cards with cash and turn over the gift cards to the scammers. So they were really despicable individuals that were taking advantage of people that didn't have anything to go on. So you remember that name that was in the document that we looked at, this Akpasiri. Well, if you actually go look in the Urban Dictionary, here you'll see what it means. It talks about someone who keeps a lot of secrets and doesn't deal well with confrontations. They seem like they're lovely people, but basically it describes a scammer. So a little bit of digging around. Went out and looked all over social media, a whole bunch of other places for places where somebody used the name Akpasiri and used king in the text of what they were talking about. And we found this individual here. It just so happened he had an old Twitter account that he decided to just talk about himself, what he did, how he did it with his friends, some other things. And interestingly enough, he likes fine things, nice houses, nice Lexus, right? Well, what's right there? His license plate. And if you have the real picture, the high-res picture, you can see that license plate very clearly. So one day we were messing with the scammers, trying to get them to take us through the interview process so we could learn more about them. I went through the interview process with one of them through one of my secret Google numbers. And at the end, I asked the scammer, I said, how do you like that gray Lexus that's parked out in front of your apartment? Dead silence. I said, yeah, you know, the one that's, with the apartment with the ring on the ground, and isn't that your license plate? And I typed the license plate into the thing. Started cursing me out immediately in Nigerian, just ranting on me. So I knew I hit pay dirt with him. So I didn't dig much further. What we did do, though, is we wanted to find out how these scammers were actually getting out to the internet, just to validate that we were right. So what we did is we tricked them into using another person and downloading a resume through a proxy site that would alert us to the IP address that they were using to bring in their connections. Most of them were working out of Nigeria, going through a Nigerian ISP through a proxy server, and a lot of them were using tablets and phones to do these scams. They weren't very sophisticated. So we made contact then with the Bank of America, and they hooked me up with their fraud department. They worked with us to get the evidence aggregated to the National Cyber Forensics Training Alliance for verification. They verified all of our findings, added it to their evidence. And one of the interesting things was that they are working with the FBI to aggregate all of these fraud cases to get them over the legal threshold for action by the U.S. Attorney General. So the problem is a lot of these individual cases, even though $7,000 seems like a lot, the U.S. Attorney won't act on any of those cases. So they aggregate these cases and bring them together at a big case against these people. So with all that done, what happened within a week after we turned that evidence over to the FBI, all 10 phone numbers used by the scammers were no longer in use. The impersonation of Graylog, our company, stopped. There were no additional reports of any scams. All the lookalike domains had been confiscated by the registrars, and we were unable to make further contact with the scammers. So at that point, we knew that something in the background had happened, and we didn't have any insight into what that was. So now go back to how you would feel if you were a victim. Now imagine you signed one of these fake job offers. You gave notice to your current place of employment. So this was a big problem, right? Even though a lot of people were not scammed out of any money per se, as soon as they signed that agreement for that $90,000 a year job, they immediately go, hey boss, I'm out of here later, right? They'd quit their job. So now they're out without a job. Some of them were without money, and they were just in a really bad situation. So you can imagine if this would happen to you. Not a good situation. These were nasty people that really took advantage of a lot of vulnerable people. So how were they able to, why were they able to change their tactics so quickly? One of the things that Made it much easier for these scammers to do this was obviously COVID. Everybody's working remotely. There's much less person-to-person connection, and everybody can work from anywhere. So it lowers the barrier for gaining trust as it doesn't induce as much suspicion. We're doing things over Zoom, we're doing things over chat, just seems more plausible. In fact, I talked to one victim who was scammed 3 different times for 3 different companies, but by the same set of scammers. And I asked her, I said, why did you let this happen the 3rd time? I'm just trying to understand. She goes, well, everybody's doing this. This is the way hiring's happening. This is the way things are going on in the world. So her perception was that was normal. So these scammers are taking advantage of that. We have a large victim pool as companies can now hire people from anywhere, not just the local office. And there's less layers of protection, right? You're not in an office, you don't have colleagues to look at things, you know, you're by yourself. It's just a lot easier for them to go after their victims. And then you have the proliferation of these online information outlets. There are a lot of reputable job sites, right? But there are also a lot of less than reputable ones. Those less than reputable ones will go out and scan the internet and look for job listings that your company posts at one legitimate site, and they'll link it into their site. Then what happens is you can go in and claim that as your own without any proof that you're the company that you say you are. And that's what these scammers are doing on these less than reputable sites. They also are taking advantage of poorly secured business sites. So remember I told you that these FedEx accounts were being used to send the checks to the victims? Well, I compiled a list of 7 different companies whose FedEx accounts were compromised and being used to send to the victims. None of them had a clue, not one of them. I called them all. Most of them thought I was a scammer trying to scam them. Eventually, a couple of them called me back and said, you know, it's funny that you called us before FedEx's fraud department did, but FedEx's fraud department contacted us and said our account was compromised and being used as part of a scam. Well, one of them, actually, FedEx called them because the scammers ordered 360 of those cardboard mailer envelopes. And what FedEx does is they look at your history of your mailings over time. And if something sticks out, like you've only sent 10 over the year and suddenly you're ordering 360 envelopes and drop shipped to a remote location in the middle of New York City, not your main office, it's a little bit of a red flag. So FedEx tracked that down, found out that it was not legitimate, worked with that company to give them a new FedEx account, old one open so that they could catch those scammers, and they were able to stop a number of these checks from being distributed by the scammers. But FedEx was involved in about 7 or 8 of these other accounts. So how did these accounts get compromised? First guess, password reuse, right? Using the same password for everything, don't use the account very often, no 2-factor authentication, and those credentials were stolen from some other leak. The other problem is that we're not doing a good job of communicating our standard hiring processes, right? Most places have a careers page on their website, but those careers pages don't necessarily outline the things that they need to outline, and we'll go over that here in the end as far as some recommendations. And they're also taking advantage of people in desperate situations, right? A lot of people got laid off during COVID. A lot of people are underemployed. They're not making kind of money that they need to make in an economy where the inflation rate's up. And they're mining these databases and job banks looking for people that are most likely to be victimized. All right, so, and it's also a target-rich environment. These are some of the other companies that were being victimized at the same time we were. Merrill Lynch, Bank of America, American Express. Some of these have very large fraud departments and can deal with this. Some of them don't care, right? I'm not saying any one of these is, the problem is most of the victims are reporting it, but normally a company's not under any obligation to do anything, right? Because it's not really their problem, but the right thing to do is to investigate it and make sure that you're protecting your corporate reputation. And that was the direction we took here with this information. And the scammers are also able to fly under the radar. They operate internationally, making it difficult to catch them. They employ workers for specific roles. So in this case, for example, the workers that were delivering the checks had no clue about the rest of the operation. All they knew is they were given a list of people to send these checks to and amounts and addresses, and they got paid for doing that. The victim losses aren't high enough on an individual basis to meet the U.S. Attorney General's action thresholds. The FBI and Secret Service don't really care. They like things that give them publicity, which would be like ransomware. Hey, we got money back from this $1 million ransomware thing, right? But in both conversations with FBI and Secret Service agents, they were not interested at all in helping us. And the cases are handled by the Cyber Initiative and Resource Fusion Unit, which is a good group. They're out of Pittsburgh, I believe. And if you need their contact information, I can get that for you. But they have a relationship with the FBI that allows them to get these cases aggregated and get action done on them. Come on here, Bessie. There we go. All right, so last part here. Let's talk about some actions that we can take to help reduce our exposure and how we can protect ourselves. First, just like anything else, have an incident response plan and a playbook for this type of attack, right? How are we going to handle our internal communications? What do we communicate to our employees internally? How much do we communicate? What's the process for gathering the calls or the information as it comes in? How do we communicate externally? What are we going to put on our website, our emails, our vendors? How are we going to talk to our vendors? And what do we do with the evidence that we collect? How do we distribute that in the right channels? And also, how do we gather consistent evidence from the people that are doing or that are reporting the problem, right? So in this case, we used Microsoft Forms, sent that out to everybody, and that way it was all aggregated in a central spreadsheet and very easy to keep track of. And you also have to understand the attack surface. Who's most likely to be impersonated? HR, execs, what domain names are going to be used? What type of typo squatting could be happening here, right? Purchase those domain names in advance. Make sure that you own them and keep them under your control. And there's websites out there that can analyze your website for proper headers and those sorts of things. And there are a few tools that you can use to search for things that might be used to impersonate your domains in your company. There's a company called Fortrace that makes some tools that allows you to do that sort of thing. But it'll alert you and warn you when something like a typo squatted domain gets registered and you aren't the owner of it, that sort of thing. So you need to educate people about your hiring process. Do you use an applicant portal? Most legitimate companies do use some sort of portal. Make sure that's spelled out on your website. You know, let people know that are applying what that process is. How does the process work? Who are the people that are going to contact you? And what career listing sites are on your company's approved list, so that they know right away that if they found a job listing on, you know, easyjobs.com or something, that's not one of your approved sites, and they might want to look at that one with a little bit more skepticism or verify that it's a legitimate job posting. And then monitor the threat environment. Keep up on what scams are prevalent. Are there any of your similar businesses that are similar to yours having these same kinds of issues? And look for indicators that your company may be being used in a scam. And that would be you can set up Google searches that will find look-alike domains. You can look for news articles, things like that. And you can probably search for job postings as well. So finally, got done a little faster here than I expected, but your corporate reputation takes a long time to build, and it only takes seconds to destroy, right? So you have to have a plan to respond to these reputation attacks so that you can both protect your employees and show compassion for those that are being victimized. While it's easy to think that doing nothing is acceptable, doing the right thing is a harder choice. So make that choice, and that's all I have for today. Appreciate it. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions if anybody has any. Don't everybody jump up at once. Oh, he was, go to the microphone so I can hear you. And they're recording this, so I'll repeat the question if it's not on the mic.
My question is, have you ever actually called a prince from Nigeria?
Have a prince from Nigeria? No. These are just people that are, I would call them gangster thugs that just figure out ways to. They're just con artists, and they figure out how to organize that con so that they're making a lot of money. I think it's a Nigerian prince per se. Okay.
Have you found any services or providers that will do monitoring for these kind of fraudulent behavior on social media networks? like Twitter or LinkedIn or that kind of stuff?
There are a few, mostly focused around the financial industry because stockbrokers and people that are certified financial advisors, they have to have all of their social media monitored, so they will alert for those kinds of things. I don't know any off the top of my head, and we don't use them just because there's a fee involved with doing that, but they do exist.
Thank you.
Yep.
I had a question as well.
Uh-huh.
By the way, that was a very good question. As far as what happens to these people, that are the source of this, right? What action can be taken or is taken to stop them from just spinning up the next thing? And then this other question, I was expecting they were just going to do identity theft, and then when you got to the thing that people were actually paying money for that was a little surprising that people were falling for that. I would just thought, hey, it's so easy to start filling out these forms and give your social and things like that. Yeah. That seems like anybody could be drawn into that so quickly in what seems like a legitimate, offer and stuff like that. But are you seeing both sides of that too, where it's more of identity theft, where they just want to capture enough information where they could sell that?
So I think if you look, I'll answer the second part first.
Yeah.
I think if you look at the type of victim that they were going after, the victims that were being exploited didn't have a lot of assets to begin with.
Okay.
So it wasn't worth them going after their bank accounts per se. But this was a way but with the checks, it was a way they could get large sums of money from duping less than sophisticated users that were going out and doing the job scam, right?
That makes sense.
Now, if they were going after people that had more net worth, that would be where the identity scams would come in, I would think.
I see.
And then your first question is, I can't really say what happened to them. Let's just say that I was told that you won't hear about it in the news.
Okay. Well, it's encouraging if they are.
Yes, but
taking some
things
actions.
do happen, and that's all I can say about it.
All right, thanks.
Any other questions, comments? We got lots of time.
Yeah, first of all, thanks for this presentation. This has been very enlightening. I'm really curious, what's the level of these type of scams that you saw at your company? In other words, was it 1 or 2 a day? Was it 10 a day? I'm just sort of curious about scale.
Yeah, I'm guessing that we probably got 10% of the reports, so we had 30 some over about a month. So let's say they scammed 300 people. What'll happen is they'll go and they'll use multiple companies doing the same scenario, but using different companies and different bait. That way, they're not going after the same company for a very long period of time. By the time you figure it out, they're on to being the next company, right? So in this case, my guess is they were targeting Asana before us because of the text that was in some of the documents, right? Then Asana probably got wise to it, started putting the kibosh on it, and then they just switched gears and went after somebody else.
Okay.
So they're using the same tactics, but with different targeted companies.
Yep. Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Hey, yeah, really great talk. I
Oh, thanks.
appreciate it. So it seems like you responded very quickly and pretty thoroughly. But was there any damage to your company? And any quantifiable, or is it just kind of anecdotal now?
Reputation damage
Roger.
for sure, right? Had we done nothing, I think that's the worst step you can take, because people talk, right? And people never say how great you are. They always say how bad you are, right? So if we had done nothing and ignored these people and not gotten in touch with them, I think that would have been a very bad direction to take from marketing and preservation. But also, my other concern was for Kate, our HR manager, right? Her personal reputation was being trashed, right? And then Sam a little bit as well. So, my goal is I'm here to protect, as the Director of Information Security, I'm here to protect information and people in my company, my customers' data, and our intellectual property. And that's part of it, right? Their information is their profile about their business. So that's kind of why I got involved with it. And I'm just one of these people that I think people that do this kind of crap, I can't say on camera what I would do with them. Yep. All right, appreciate it. Thanks for coming out. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy the rest of RSAC.